Hello and welcome. I'm Ollie Law, Editor-in-Chief of Unbreakable Ventures, a threat landscape email that provides entrepreneurs and businesses with resource to help them take on any disruption anywhere in the world. You are listening to our fortnightly risk email where we dive into emerging current risks from around the world, focusing on some big stories and some you may have missed. We use the categories from the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report to simplify the threats we're monitoring, but we also do some deep dives and interviews with industry peers. It's Monday the 10th of March and we're discussing the top 5 risks between the 24th of February and the 10th of March 2025, so grab a coffee and let's get into it. This week's Unbreakable Ventures podcast is a little different from our usual approach. Today we're sharing an interesting and very timely conversation between EY's Global Transformation Lead and Head of Tax Policy, Matt Andrew. In February, he sat with Shelley Gurard, the Customer Director for Maori Export Customers at the New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, also known as NZTE, to discuss US trade policy changes and how businesses need to prepare for these important changes. Matt has carved out an impressive career and is arguably the global leader in this space. He has worked deeply with multinational corporations in all continents during his career and is considered the expert in developing business modeling that integrates everything from supply chain effectiveness to corporate tax strategies, leveraging the potential of FTAs, transfer pricing, you name it, he's done it. He is living and breathing in the coalface of these uncertain times and is well placed to shed some light on what is happening today. Given that our number one threat this week is the wider implications of President Trump's tariffs, our team is pleased to bring you this insightful and in-depth discussion, which we will place at the back of this podcast. First though, let's talk about other risks identified this fortnight. Before we do, please also feel free to share Unbreakable Ventures with your contacts and peers if you think someone else would benefit from the information we research. Our work is designed to inform and support business leaders to make the best decisions in times of adversity. So with that in mind, let's look at our first risk. In the unfolding maritime drama between Taiwan and China, a new chapter has emerged that speaks volume about the delicate geopolitical balance in the region. Taiwan has detained a Chinese-linked cargo vessel which they suspect is involved in damaging 2 crucial undersea internet cables near the Taiwanese island of Matsu. The detention of the vessel, a gravel ship registered in Sierra Leone but with significant Chinese connections, does represent more than just a technical incident. It embodies the deeper narrative of Taiwan's ongoing struggle to maintain its sovereignty in the shadow of Beijing's influence. Authorities took decisive action after reviewing surveillance footage that placed the vessel near both cable ruptures on February 2nd and February 8th. The incident severely disrupted communications for the 14,000 residents of Matsu and required weeks of repair by technicians. This maritime confrontation reflects the broader tensions in the Taiwan Strait, where infrastructure vulnerabilities intersects with questions of national security, and where even something as seemingly mundane as a gravel ship can become entangled in the complex web of cross-strait relations. Businesses should consider the risk of escalating cyber and physical infrastructure disruptions due to increased geopolitical tensions, potentially leading to communication blackouts and supply chain interruptions. This could force businesses to invest in redundant systems and alternative communication pathways, while also facing increased regulatory scrutiny and potential trade restrictions. Findings from multiple sources suggest that the 5 major GenAI labs that produce our most popular large language models, like ChatGPT, are not profitable, and the cost to run these companies is no longer sustainable. ChatGPT's operational costs in 2024 was $9 billion, with a reported loss of $5 billion. The fees these LLMs charge for API access, token usage, or a pro subscription are not providing enough return for any of the labs or their investors to become profitable. Key players like Microsoft, who are heavy investors in OpenAI, with a reported 13 to 14 billion invested up to 2023, appear to be recalibrating their AI strategy amid concerns about OpenAI's growing compute demands and their uncertain profitability. This is evidenced by a significant 14% reduction in planned data center capacity and paused expansion projects, possibly signaling diminished confidence in generative AI's immediate growth potential and financial sustainability. Additionally, AI labs out of China are producing LLMs running on a fraction of the compute costs with significant output in comparison to its competitors. It's a key reason Nvidia saw the largest single drop in stock value earlier this year. Businesses need to consider their reliance on AI and how ingrained AI bots and processes have become to their organization. Because if external AI tools linked through simple APIs begin to fail, significant disruption is imminent. Our top risk this week concerns the Trump administration's drastic tariffs imposed on Canada, China, and Mexico on March 5th. Whilst the coverage has mostly been on how China and Canada plan to retaliate, a recent webinar discussion between the NZTE and EY's Matt Andrew brings to light a proliferating risk to exporters globally. Since this discussion in February, a few theories Matt raises has been realised. For instance, Matt talks about the likelihood of further negotiation with trade partners prior to the March 4th deadline. And of course, we now know where we sit with these and are now witnessing a geopolitical drama not seen in decades. The real value of this discussion comes from the mitigation and preparation techniques EY are sharing with their clients. But the deeper message is that global trade and geopolitical tensions can and do affect those not directly in the firing line. The following extract covers what top global transformation analysts suggest businesses around the globe can do to mitigate loss and continue to maintain strong relationships with foreign partners. And while there is a focus specifically on New Zealand businesses, it relates to everyone. So enjoy this tactical and informative discussion with Matt Andrew of EY and Shelley Gerard of NZTE.
Thanks, everyone. I'm currently based living in Hong Kong, so spending a lot of time in China at the moment and working on this issue as well. So, today what I'm going to talk a little bit about is some of the background, so number one will be to inform you what's actually happened and what's actually happening, and it's kind of happening day to day. So we're getting changes. I wake up in the morning in Asia and something has happened overnight in terms of a document having come out from the US administration. And then secondly, I'll provide some thoughts in terms of what companies are actually doing at the moment in terms of thinking about a reaction, assessing their risk, and potentially thinking about what the plans are to mitigate that risk. And then also thirdly, thinking about what those next steps might be as well. So where are we? I think what we do know is under the US administrative trade policy, we had some announcements from the US administration in relation to 3 countries. So 25% tariffs put on Mexican products, and that has since been delayed until March 2025. We had Canada also in the firing line with 25% on all products except 10% on energy resources, in discussions with the Trudeau administration that was then delayed until March 2025. And then 10% on all products all China products into the US, and that's effective. I think the important point to note about the China products is we already have another 20% tariff which exists on those products from the first Trump administration back in 2017. This is now on top of those. And I think what's important as well is the breadth. These are tariffs applied to all sectors, industries, and products, and are already in addition to other duties already applied. I think the concern from if you're a treaty lawyer, is there's a concern about what does this executive order relate to in terms of the Mexico, Canada, US agreement, the USMCA. It seems to ignore this existing trade agreement and just overrides that. I'm using the term here, and you'll see here EO. EO is short term for executive order, and I think that's probably important to note. These are executive orders which are coming out of the administration. This is not legislation coming through the US Parliament. So effectively, what we have is an administration and a presidency with a lot of power to do things which are outside Congress, and can make these rules specific. And he can make these rules because these are under the emergencies. So the president can make these executive orders if there's an emergency in place. And what we're hearing is there's an emergency in place, connected to, for example, fentanyl coming in, and whether that's our perspective, that's right or not, that's the basis on which these executive orders have been executed, and is now disrupting global trade.
So Matt, just interesting on that, with how those executive orders can come into place so quickly. What's changed from the first Trump administration, which means that these can literally come in overnight or change overnight?
Yeah, I think these are always, it was always possible to do that, Shelley, but you do need a basis for this emergency. And the basis for this emergency has been, for example, with Mexico, this fentanyl issue. And that's why when the delay has occurred with Mexico, because the the Mexican government basically said, okay, we'll put troops on the border with the US to stop this fentanyl coming across, and that was the basis for the delay. Now, over the weekend, or early this week, we heard President Trump make a comment around this delay, and so there's a question whether this delay is until March 2025, or will this go on? And I'll come back to this particular point, but he made a point, no, I will be doing tariffs on Mexican and Canadian products. And so I think, again, this is a moving feast, but I think these executive orders mean this, and we've got this administration. So my public policy folk on the Hill in the US always talk about the first 100 days. And what we've seen from Elon Musk and what we've seen from President Trump is they're using this first 100 days in this executive order, this emergency, to really stamp their own framework on global relations. And so we've got this override to the USMCA, this treaty, this trade treaty. We've got this override, this executive order, which came out and said, this de minimis rule of $800 or less. So if you're an e-commerce provider selling goods from New Zealand into the US, and which is goods with their landed cost, and that's a term used to land product into another jurisdiction for customs and VAT and customs and VAT purposes, then you would say landed cost for customs purposes in the US is less than $800. It's the de minimis rule, so therefore we're not going to apply any tariffs. Well, we've obviously got this executive order which says that de minimis rule has been eliminated. That may come back because I don't think customs in the US is able to actually administer that. That's the viewpoint from some commentators, but I think that will be used for certain jurisdictions for certain types of goods for sure. We also had this executive order which is the duty drawback. The refund of import duties when products are exported is not available for duties imposed pursuant to these executive orders. And what that means is, for example, if I'm a Kiwi exporter sending product into the US, which I don't sell, which is faulty, which goes obsolete, so I re-export it, then I can get my duty back. Now that rule, which is used commonly by exporters, will not be available for these 25% tariffs, Mexican tariffs, Canadian tariffs, 25% Canadian tariffs, and this 10% on China tariffs. It's still available under the existing 301 trade sanctions and tariffs which have been implemented under legislation, but not these executive order tariffs. And so that's something which I think is is really important. So you might still be able to get drawback on other tariffs which are already in place, but for these tariffs, you cannot get drawback on. So I think that changes a lot. For example, if you're using the US as a place to go, okay, I'm going to land product in Los Angeles in a big warehouse at the port, for example, or the airport, whatever, and then I'm going to then re-export to Canada. I'm using it as a drop ship point for Canada, and I'm making stuff up, Central America, etc. Then that would be something which you wouldn't do now because you can't get duty drawback on these particular tariffs. You might be able to use a free trade zone, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then there's no inverted tariff relief when import duties on a finished product are lower than the duty on raw material in a free trade zone. And even if the tariffs are temporary and goods are admitted from the 4th of February 2025 onwards, then you can't get that, you won't have that inverted tariff relief anymore. And so I also think the important point here is this is not static, and as you'll be able to pick up as well as I can, which is this is a moving feast every single day, and so we're constantly watching and monitoring and focusing what's actually going to happen. And I think what the US administration has said over and over again is that they will retaliate if there's an increase, if the country reacts, if another country reacts to their tariffs as well. So we could see an increase in rate or a broadening of the tariffs as we go on as well. And so I go to the White House website every day and I look for the executive orders and the fact sheets which come out from that, and that's under the America First Trade Policy Memorandum. So that's where we are at the moment. So we're waiting eagerly to see whether these tariffs, first of all, for Mexico and Canada, will actually be applied in March, from the 1st of March, which is pretty close, next week, I think, maybe over the weekend, and see whether that actually comes into effect. There have been comments already back. A lot of these jurisdictions are not going to lie down, which kind of surprised me a little bit, to be honest, but Canada's already come out and said they're going to apply tariffs on 155 billion of US goods, which relate to, for example, a not exhaustive list, but beer, wine, bourbon, vegetables, fruit juices, perfumes, clothing, shoes, etc. So where you've got product sitting in warehouses in Canada potentially, which have a Canadian origin, because it's been manufactured or has parts, components, for example, then that might be hit as well, coming in from Canada, and also there's immediate tariffs on 30 billion of goods effective from the 4th of February as well. Mexico has said that it's got a proposed Plan B, which doesn't provide any specifics other than it includes tariffs and non-tariff measures, and I think that's really important as well. Is we're not talking just about tariffs, we're talking about sanctions and export controls as well, which I'll cover in a little bit. Mexico also said from the 3rd of February 2025 that tariffs by Canada and Mexico are postponed until the March 2025 as well. I'll come back to China as well. China immediately announced it's got 15% tariffs on coal, LNG, and other commodities, 10% on crude oil. It's also gone to the World Trade Organization and complained, and will also be implementing new export controls on critical minerals as well. And so I think that's the immediate reaction, but there'll be further reactions as we go along, and we can figure out and if and when the US does implement these tariffs, we would expect to see more detail from Mexico and more tariffs from Canada and reactions from Canada and China as well. China is currently working on its own framework of how to respond to the US, and that's going on in the background. And I see some of the discussions with that as well. I think looking ahead, I think the concern is this is not the end. This is not the end of the road for these. We're not just talking about Canada. We're not just talking about Mexico. We're not just talking about China. So there is this existing situation going on where I'll come back to this. There's this fair and reciprocal plan proposal, which is going to come out on the 2nd of April. And so in February, 13th of February, the US administration signed a memorandum, and it's working on a plan and developing a plan to determine whether there are reciprocal tariffs required. And they're going through an approach for each of their trading partners. And so they're considering where they consider US multinationals to be unfairly treated, then they need to respond to that. And that could be related to trade, it could be related to tax, it could be related to other economic factors which are impacting the competitiveness of US multinationals in that jurisdiction. And so that could be, for example,
Just on that note, interesting that you raised that about the other countries, Matt. I mean, we talk about China, Canada, Vietnam, Mexico, those ones that really come to the forefront that are in the media and we do know about.
Yeah.
Countries with what you were talking about, that's not necessarily just about the trade component.
It's not.
That might be coming to the forefront for what you're seeing with the work that you're doing.
Yeah, look, it is. And I was in discussions this week with some Japanese multinationals, and they're very concerned because Japan has a trade surplus and Japan has a consumption tax, which is kind of like a sales tax, kind of like a VAT, but that's considered to be anti-competitive against US multinationals. And so Japan is highly concerned that it will be hit with some trade tariffs. Korea, had some discussions with the Ministry of Finance in Korea, is very concerned because it's got a VAT, and it has a very significant trade surplus because it sells cars, it sells televisions and stuff through LG, Samsung, etc. into the US, and so it's very concerned. Even this week, the Australian Treasurer is in the US at the moment in discussions with US negotiators on this particular issue. And there's 2 or 3 different reasons why it's there. It's not just because of trade-related matters around aluminum and steel, which is a significant concern to Australia, obviously, but it's also because there have been traditional sanctions against US beef coming into Australia. It's also because Australia has a GST. It's also because Australia has some has very specific concerns connected to US's concerns connected to some of the Australian tax legislation, which it considers to be targeting US multinationals. And so, for the first time, I think we're seeing this view from the US, which is not just around, oh, you did this to me, so I'm going to do this to you. It's looking at the economy as a whole and saying, are you playing fairly with my US multinationals? And so are you allowing me to import goods? And if not, I'm going to impose tariffs. Do you tax my US businesses like with the digital services taxes? Now, New Zealand has a digital services tax, which it might turn on. And so are you looking at my workers and consumers fairly? And it's including VAT, GST. Are there specific costs to US businesses which arise from non-tariff barriers or measures, for example, and policies and practice that relate to exchange rate, what they consider to be manipulation of exchange rates? So this brings Indonesia in. This brings India in, because you've got foreign exchange controls along with China, and also parts of Eastern Europe as well. And so this is very, very broad. And so I think from this perspective, we are sort of seeing this review going on, and we'll get some output from this in April. So my point of this is to sort of say it's not just Mexico, China, and Canada. I'm expecting to see a significant number of other jurisdictions drawn into this list with a level of tariffs imposed because of these sorts of economic issues, which are not just trade-related, but tax and business-related as well. And China has come out and also said, if you do this, then we will be looking very specifically to provide anti-foreign sanction laws, which allow China to sanction goods coming in from other jurisdictions. They've got this unreliable entity list, So you can limit or eliminate access to Chinese markets for foreign companies if you come onto this list. They've got an expanded export controls list. And this export controls is around what's referred to as dual-use products. So if you're in technology or IP, potentially pharmaceutical, then it will sanction you from allowing to export from China those goods, because it could be used also for military purposes, such as chips, semiconductor technology, IP related to that, and even pharmaceutical as well. And so these are all considered to be warning shots. If you do this, we will come after you as well.
Hey, so Matt, while you're on China, let's just talk about a scenario. So you have someone that may be using a component from China, bringing it to New Zealand, and then developing it into a beautiful product, New Zealand made, with an amazing USP, and seeing it up. What sort of impact should a business like that be thinking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. And I think that's what's really important for today. Sorry, I'm just not sure if you can see my screen here. This diagram, I'm trying to show the diagram here, which is, I think there are the way that I think about it is there are two ways that you could be impacted. You could have for example, again, I'm just making up a scenario. I could be a Kiwi-owned business with my shareholders in New Zealand, which has a subsidiary entity in the mainland of China. And so I'm buying parts and I'm manufacturing goods, which I then send directly from my China entity or my China third-party manufacturer to the US. So the product goes direct, but I might invoice through New Zealand, or I might have a subsidiary entity in the US, which I go third-party manufacturer sells to my US distribution entity. And then I'm going to have this extra 10% on top of my 20% tariffs. The other option is what I consider to be what I refer to, and so that's you're directly impacted because you're connected to China and the US trade flows. So your product's moving that way, and you've got your invoices and cash flow moving as well. You could be indirectly impacted, which is the second point below. And what I mean by that is you could be in a situation like a Kiwi company and you're buying parts or raw material or components, which you're then sending into, I'm making stuff up here, you're then sending stuff into Thailand or back to New Zealand to be assembled and manufactured into a finished product, which you're then sending on to the US either through a third-party distributor, or you might have set up your own entity. That you could also be impacted that way as well. Or the same could be, you could be making raw material parts component or doing secondary assembly in Mexico or secondary assembly in Canada. And that could be expanded to, I expect, Vietnam or Korea or Thailand, Indonesia, for example. And so what that means is because you've got what the US is looking to do is it's trying to address the issue of like saying, well, I've got a finished product from New Zealand, I'm not impacted. Now they're going to look through that and look at your components. And that's called, have you got enough substantial transformation in New Zealand where you've manufactured that it's really become a New Zealand product, or do you still have enough content in terms of the raw material parts, primary manufacturing, where it's still, from their perspective, a China product? We don't know yet what those thresholds will be, but when we look at some of the FTAs, free trade agreements, etc., it could be 40, 50%. We're trying to find information out around what would still be considered enough of a China product to be hit with these tariffs, or enough of a Canadian product, or enough of a Mexican product, and who knows, Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Indonesia, etc., which might be other jurisdictions impacted in this part of the world. So that's what I call indirectly impacted. Your supply chain is connected to these jurisdictions, which even though you're selling from New Zealand into the US, you still need to figure out whether you've got a potential impact or not.
Matt, in this, I think everyone's getting this incredibly complex matrix that you are living in day to day. What are you seeing as far as businesses with supply chains where they're nervous? Are people acting now?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I raised this. I mean, your timing's kind of perfect, Shelley. So there's a group of people, right, which would say, I put this on here. I saw this actually in the media. I survived the global trade war of 3rd of February 25 to the 3rd of February 25. And that's when the administration came out and sort of said, yes, we're going to impose tariffs. No, we're going to delay tariffs until March. And so there is a piece of this. Is it real? Is it not real? And this is just my personal perspective, which is it's a fair question. I think there is a determination, and we did see 20% tariffs in the first Trump administration go around in 2017. I think he's come on the back of making America great again. I would expect that we will see tariffs and even expanded to jurisdictions which are not there yet. That's my personal perspective. Others think, no, this is just a bluff to get what I want to get, but we'll see. But what I do sort of see here is multinationals are trying to assess their current situation, which is do I have a footprint in geopolitical risk, which is connected to the jurisdictions which have tariffs imposed. So I see small companies, mid-sized companies, and large Fortune 500s and Fortune 50 companies trying to make an assessment, which is for their C-suite, for their stakeholders and their shareholders, and quite frankly, their bankers as well now, is do I have a risk to my enterprise because I've got a connection of a supply chain, I'm buying raw material parts, or I'm manufacturing one of these jurisdictions, or is one of these jurisdictions at risk of being bought into the tariff sanction export control net? And so I think what I'm sort of saying is I don't see any, outside of maybe one or two very large multinationals, trying to fundamentally change their footprint. What I do see them trying to do at the moment is to say, do I have a risk? Do I have a connection to this jurisdiction because I buy a raw material plant or a manufacturer and I sell into the US? Am I at risk of doing this? Or no, I bring the raw material parts components back to New Zealand, I change it here, I do everything to it here, so I've got substantial transformation. So I think my risk is managed. And so first of all, that's do I have a risk? If I do have a risk, what is it? Is it real? Potentially real? Is it coming? And do I need to think about what the financial impact is to my business, to my transfer pricing of my goods into that market? Can I eat it, that potential risk, or can I somehow mitigate it as well? And so that's one of the things which on the right-hand side, you sort of see here where I've got this assess the customs duty transfer price and planning risk. So what I do sort of see, if companies are saying, wow, I think about risk, I manufacture in Mexico, I've got goods coming out of China, I've got a risk. What can I potentially do? And so I think there are some short-term things which my clients are sort of thinking about, and multinationals I talk to are thinking about, which is maybe 2 or 3 different ways of working through this issue. The first is, can I apply, if I've got a trade flow which goes, I make it in China, I sell it to New Zealand, and then from New Zealand I sell it to the US. And so can I use the US first sale rule for export planning? And so what that is I might go, instead of my landed cost being, so I buy it from China to New Zealand at $90, and I sell it from New Zealand to the US at $120. I'm not going to have my landed cost at $120. I'm going to try and land it in my first sale between China and New Zealand at $90. And the reason I'm trying to do that, and a lot of companies are looking at the first sale rule for export, is because if my landed cost is less, the potential impact of the customs of the tariff is less. And so the first sale is one thing that companies are looking at the moment. Is this something that I should be thinking about? Is it something I'm already doing? Is this or can I do more? The second is what I would refer to as unbundling. And so sometimes when you have a landed cost of a product, it could also include a royalty component, a service component. It could include a warranty cost, an insurance cost, etc. And so what some companies will try and do in high tariff countries or high tariff trade flows is to unbundle and say, I'm going to take out that warranty cost and charge it separately, for example. I'm going to take out the royalty component and have a separate charge for that. Or I'm going to take out my service cost and have it as a separate charge to the entity. And so my landed cost is the product cost, not the bundled cost of the royalty, the service, the warranty, and the product. So you unbundle the price. And so some multinationals and companies are also looking at, is there anything I can unbundle? Sometimes there is, sometimes there's not. The third is this customs effect of transfer pricing. So when you're selling from, for example, New Zealand to your distributor, your own distributor in the US, for example, or your China distributor to your US distributor, your manufacturer to the US distributor, you're looking at the transfer price, which is, again, your transfer price of the product, which is cost plus, or some type of resale price, or some type of customs valuation. You're looking to understand whether there's something you can do with the transfer price from China to the US, from China to New Zealand to the US, to reduce that transfer price. So again, it goes to the landed cost. Now, that's all a little bit technical, but the first sale, the unbundling, and the transfer price are short-term mechanisms, short-term points to look at to assess whether there's anything you can do in the short term to say, if I have a risk, I think I've got a risk, I might have these as my 3 or 4 levers to work on to limit the impact of that. There are other things which multinational in the midterm and companies are looking at as well. And so now this is number 3, special supply chain and customs programs. I mentioned the duty drawback program, how that had been eliminated for these executive order tariffs into the US. But there are other tariffs which you might not be aware of, you might not be using, which is I'm landing product for re-export, or landing product which has gone obsolete, so I'm buying back to New Zealand. I'm landing product on consignment, for example, which is I don't sell, so I'm resending on to the UK, or I'm resending on to Canada, or I'm resending on elsewhere. Those might be available for which you're currently not leveraging the duty drawback programs. And so I think it's identifying opportunities and prioritizing these programs, which you can uncover some opportunities. I think it's also using potentially bonded warehouses, or sometimes what's referred to as foreign trade zones. And so you do have these in parts of the US, like in Houston, for example, and parts of the East Coast of the US, and parts of the Gulf area as well, like around Florida, which is you land product into a bonded zone, but it's not yet in the net of the US customs. And because it's considered outside the US net. And so I think those are kind of helpful potentially to potentially leverage and unlock to see if there's any delaying of the customs duties. It doesn't eliminate, because if you have a desire to enter the US, what you're doing is you're delaying the cash flow impact of the tariff until which time you have a client or a distributor which says, I need this product into Ohio right now, please send it, and then you pay it. But that might have a cash flow opportunity, and that's also the same for foreign trade zones, which is a benefit from duty deferral or reduction or deferral, depending on whether you land it and then re-export it as well. So those are kind of things which I sort of see as the immediate things. Number one on this slide, is there something I can do with the landed cost price through first sale, unbundling, or transfer pricing? That's the first. And the second is, are there things that I can think about in terms of the schemes available, which the customs authority allows me? Duty drawback, bonded warehouse, free trade zone, and there are other assessment tax incentives which might be available as well. Longer term, if these really do, and so that's these two things, areas number 2 and number 3, I would call no regrets planning, which is I might do that I might think about doing that very seriously if in March those tariffs do come into play. I might be looking very seriously at number 2 and number 3 in figuring out what I can do there quite quickly. I think in number 4, I would wait. I think in number 4, this is really looking at. Sorry, Shelley, did you want to comment now before I move on to number
Matt,
4?
there's just a few questions that are coming through here. One that popped up relevant to supply chain that you're talking about is around primary sector. If you're looking at the meats, the dairies, etc., the value add hasn't necessarily happened once it's hopped on the ship. Do you want to talk around that topic a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Even with some agricultural products or value-added agricultural products. So I would say with pure commodities, you don't often see the royalty component in the actual product price. Sometimes with what I call non-durable consumer products, you will see the royalty component and a service component, and maybe even elements of a product liability pricing into that product, depending on how it lands. But those are the things that I would look at in terms of, are there things that I could, in this case, unbundle? That might be kind of hard, but I might look very seriously and look very closely, instead of unbundling, at the first sale rule. If it's come from somewhere else, so I'm making stuff up again. I bought stuff from Thailand, or I bought stuff from Australia. I've sold into New Zealand, invoiced through New Zealand, and then sent directly to the US. I might look at first sale there. I also might look at my transfer price and see if I could do something with the transfer price to reduce the landed cost of that commodity. If I was doing value-added agricultural products, which had been picked and packed, etc., I might then look at unbundling, for example, and look at the non-product costs to pull those out. And so I do think there are things. I do work with some large agricultural and commodity-based multinationals in Japan, for example, in China and parts of Europe, who are still looking at all of these elements. They're also looking here, for example, at how they land into the US. So I've got quite a few clients, to be honest with you, which land to stock. So they stock. They use a warehouse in the US to stock, and you pull stock into the warehouse, and then it's refreshed through the distribution network. And so it's effectively stock to hold as opposed to stock to sell. And so it's stock to hold. I do see some multinationals thinking about, okay, if I'm going to have to pay tariffs on stock to hold, and I can get some of my duty drawback under the existing tariffs, but I can't under the new, I might move to just in time. I might move to a warehouse situation which is outside the US but closer to the US, so Puerto Rico, for example, Panama, whatever, and then I might do stock to hold from that jurisdiction, and then do just in time delivery from there. Or I might use a bonded warehouse, but bonded warehouses can be a little expensive depending on where you are, not so much in Texas, but other parts of the US as well. So I might start to play around with my warehousing situation if I'm holding lots of commodity and I've got in a cold storage situation. I'm going to need to be relatively close, but I might not want to land it in the US customs net, but in the bonded net outside in the bonded zone, or somewhere close by, and then do just in time. So I've got some multinationals thinking about that, even with non-durable goods, as a planning mechanism. The other thing I think as well, and this is number 4 here, I think we do also sort of see over time, you're thinking short term, what can I do with my price, my landing cost price? What can I do with some of the schemes available that I've been talking about? The third thing I might think about in the midterm is I'm going to be thinking a little bit about my cost reduction strategies. I'm going to be thinking about if I've got a lot of components and raw materials and parts, I've got contract manufacturing or consignment manufacturing or toll manufacturing in one of these jurisdictions which are impacted. I might think about where else can I source from to reduce my China component or my Mexican component or Canadian component, or where else? And so I've got so that gives me substantial transformation in a jurisdiction which is not impacted by these incentives. Now, that's something I'm not advocating you do now, because we don't know what those other jurisdictions will be, and we don't exactly know whether Trump at the moment, we will know in a week's time whether the Trump administration, the US administration, will impose these tariffs. But I think I've got multinationals and companies, big and small, thinking about longer term. I need to think about where I source and procure from. Longer term, I need to think about where my next my contract manufacturer is, if that's what you're doing, so that I can reduce my tariff risk, my trade risk connected to those jurisdictions which are clearly in the sights of the US. And I approach that with a little bit of caution, because I mean, some commentators will tell you, well, look, we've got 4 years of this administration, and then it might go back. And that's true. In my experience, with when you change contract manufacturing, when you change procurement, that's not 2 months, that's 6 months, 12 months, 2 years change. But I think that footprint change is something that multinationals will also be thinking about, and companies are also thinking about as well. And then I think lastly on this relates to those of you that have manufacturing offshore. There are other companies that are thinking about, well, if I'm going to be hit on this 25% here, where else can I reduce my costs to cost of procurement, cost to assemble, cost to manufacture, cost to deliver. And so, and that might include, for example, lower cost locations, but might also include some types of incentives which you can get in other jurisdictions in ASEAN, which might give you, like, for example, a lease holiday, a rent holiday. And that's kind of going on a lot at the moment, because there's a lot of competition in ASEAN, for example, in Vietnam and Indonesia and Thailand, Malaysia, etc., around trying to capture what they refer to as the China Plus One. So the China Plus One model sort of came out under the first Trump administration, and a lot of companies are trying to de-risk their supply chains into Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. So I think that's also something the larger exporters might want to think about as well. But I think in all of these, you've got some things which you're going to be impacted by. And so I think I put a red tag around this, trying to think a little bit about which groups of you are most impacted or potentially have an impact to you. So group one, New Zealand exporters with manufacturing, production or processing in the United States and with heavy imports of inputs. So some of you might be actually doing some manufacturing in the US, for example, but you're importing parts of raw material from Mexico or from China or from Canada, and that might have an impact and bring you into the tariff net. And so you're going to be thinking about an impact assessment. Is there anything you can do with transfer pricing, incentives, and managing your supply chain? This group, I think, is probably a large group of exporters from New Zealand. New Zealand exporters who manufacture or source goods in China, Canada, Mexico, and sell to the US. So that's those of you which are doing some type of manufacturing in those locations, and that in other locations that might be impacted as well. You are going to be wanting to assess the risk, the potential financial cost of the tariffs, whether you can pass it on or not, in terms of where you are positioned in the market, and then also what you can do with the things around the pricing I've talked about, and also your supply chain as well. And then New Zealand exporters who export to the US from their local market, excluding China as well, which I think will be a lower impact as well. Sorry, Shelley.
Yeah, a couple of questions, Matt, on what you're proposing there. One being around, and I'll put them together just so you can work out the priority given the nature of time we've got. One around, what are you seeing with businesses with their pricing? How is this impacting bottom line? And what are their pricing strategies? Because what is going to happen with inflation, and then hence what is going to happen with pricing? And are there actually opportunities that sit within that? And the second component, which is quite separate to that, is you mentioned digital services tax. before.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure even the tech and services companies on the call today will have their ears perked up to that. What is that like? Where's New Zealand's position in that? Is that a challenge, or could that be an opportunity given New Zealand isn't necessarily under the immediate spotlight with it?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Yes, I mean, good questions. I think, I mean, to your first question, I think what I've sort of found when you really dig into the pricing, a lot of, and I'm just being very open here, a lot of Kiwi exporters. I've been with NZT as a beachhead advisor for 9 years, and so I've seen hundreds of Kiwi companies go offshore. But it doesn't matter. Australian companies, China companies, European companies. What I see is often you're pricing from a market perspective. What can the market bear? And with these tariffs, will I have to? Can I pass on the 25% of my pricing, or do I have to eat some of it? And if I have to eat some of it, then where else can I get? I can be more efficient in my pricing itself, and that goes to cost reduction programs in terms of where I source raw material from. That goes to the cost to manufacture. That goes to the cost of logistics. That also goes, can I use some of these? Can I be a little smarter about how I enter the market? So can I use the duty drawback scheme? Can I unbundle and pull that out and not charge that, or charge separately, and really dissect the price itself? Because that in myself, I think that creates opportunities. And we've already got some clients, including a Kiwi company, which is going through this assessment, what I call a rapid assessment of what are my costs, what are my risks, what are my opportunities, and are already starting to find that if they do some things slightly differently, drawback schemes, bonded zones, for example, pricing, that there might be some actual cost saving where they can eat potentially most of this risk and keep the right price relatively same, which they think will give them an opportunity to expand their market because they're going to be more competitive. So I do think there are opportunities there with a little bit of work. I think the second thing on the digital services taxes, I raised that because that will be something which I think will come in 2025, 2026. It was delayed by 3 or 4 years. And that's where you get a charge, like this is what they call the GAFA tax, the Google, the Amazon, the Facebook, the Apple. So when I was at the OECD, there was a whole program around should we be charging these remote providers of services and markets which are not taxed in the local country to impose the digital services taxes on them. My expectation is most jurisdictions will want to apply that. New Zealand has said that it will apply that as well. And that's just to capture those remote multinationals who don't have an actual physical presence in a jurisdiction, but are actually drawing a lot of income from that location, such as for example, like an Apple, you might buy, or a Spotify, you might buy some music and have a subscription, but that income doesn't belong in New Zealand. That belongs back in Sweden or wherever it is. So I think that will come on as well. So I think that's maybe less of an opportunity, to be honest, Shelley, and that's more around managing that digital service tax as it comes on as well. So I think just as I close now, I think for me, what I've tried to give you is a little bit of background of why we're sort of seeing the US look at these executive orders and have gone out very strongly under this administration to impose tariff sanctions and potentially export controls. We've already seen some responses from those jurisdictions. I would expect we'll see an expansion under this review that's going on. And this review, as I mentioned, is not just a trade review. It's not just a surplus review. I think it's an economy-wide review, which is how the US multinationals interact with the country and whether they're treated fairly or not. That we need to continue to monitor. And NZTE will keep you updated in relation to that. I think what I would do is if you have this where you've got a direct connection of goods going from China, Mexico, Canada, into the US, or you've got a indirect connection, which is the supply chain components, raw material parts. So you've actually got substantial transformation from a China perspective, or you've got content, which might bring you in there. I would want to understand what's my risk, so do I have a risk? Number one. Number two, if I do have a risk, what can I do in the short term as potentially my B plan to manage that? That's the pricing strategies I talked about. First sale, unbundling, transfer pricing. Number two, what could I take advantage of to manage through this potentially that I'm not already doing? I might want to think about bonded warehouse, for example, duty drawback schemes, just-in-time delivery from another location, a bonded zone or outside the US. And then I would want to assess what's realistic for me and not realistic based on the financial impact. And that financial impact might mean a loss of market share. It might mean a loss of profit because you're eating some of that potential tariff because you don't feel that you can pass it on, or somewhere in between. And then you need a strategy around that pricing. And then I would, once we've got clarity in terms of what the US will do, in terms of Canada, Mexico, China, and other jurisdictions, I would want to then be talking to my C-suite, my owner, my stakeholders, and say, this is the short-term plan, the mid-term plan, and yes, we are looking potentially at procuring elsewhere or doing assembly elsewhere, or thinking about the longer-term impact to your supply chain as well. So that for me is kind of the sort of end, I guess, sort of recommendation and what I see with my clients doing. And so I think, Shelley, hopefully that's been a little bit useful in terms of what's happening now. It's a moving feast. It'll change tomorrow. So we need to keep the team up to date.
That's it for today's update. If you need help navigating these threats or building a plan to protect your business, the same advisors who collate these insights are here to help. Head over to unbreakableventures.com to book a complimentary chat online with one of them. And if you found this resource useful, consider subscribing to Unbreakable Ventures or sharing the article to your LinkedIn network. After all, resilience is about community and communication. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, stay safe.
Unbreakable Ventures is brought to you by the senior advisory team at Fix Inc., a boutique resilience advisory based in Oceania and the ASEAN region. Special thanks to Europe's leading SaaS provider for resilience software, F24. Our articles are researched and published by industry specialists across New Zealand, Australia, Malaysia, and the United Kingdom. This podcast provides advice and information on disaster recovery and the threat landscape. The content is not a substitute for expert guidance during a crisis. Unbreakable Ventures is a publication operated by Fix Inc. Consulting Partners, a Fix Inc. Group company.